you recently visited a farm, and instead of seeing cows which have horns, instead what you saw were dehorned cattle. This struck you as odd, so you asked the farmer. The farmer told you that they have to often surgically dehorn their cattle. This process helps protect the farmers and the cattle when they live in close proximity. However, this gets you wondering if there are other ways to dehorn cattle. Maybe you can find a less invasive way to do this. You decide to look this up, and what you come across is a lot of resources about this issue. The resources you find discuss the interactions with government, industry, science, and society to dehorning cattle. Let's first look at the government section. What are government regulations on farming, specifically on farming animals? Before we look into the policies around farming, let's first define what intensive animal farming is. It's defined as maximizing production while minimizing costs. This often prioritizes production over animal welfare. Historically, governments have provided a number of laws regarding animal welfare in farming practices. These include laws about the number of animals in a certain area and the conditions that the animals live in. However, a lot of new legislation might regulate what genetic modifications can occur within the animals. This represents a shift in the regulation. But how does the government decide when to change the rules? This is a difficult question to answer, but luckily we don't have to answer it alone. Let's talk to researcher Erin Ryan. Erin is currently a PhD student in the Daniel Weary Lab at UBC. Her research specifically looks into animal welfare and its implications. So first off, would you mind telling us how you first got involved in this field?
My name's Erin Ryan, and I'm a PhD student in applied animal biology, which is in the animal welfare science program at UBC. How did I get into what I'm doing now? Well, I'd say most of my life, my dream has been to help animals, and I thought that veterinary medicine was the path to that dream. So I followed that path to begin with, and for quite some time. And along the way, I found the animal welfare program and fell in love. And specifically, I should add large animal or farm animal medicine was where I was interested in helping. But I found that veterinary medicine looked at animals through a lens of health. And through animal welfare, I discovered that there are different and multiple lenses that we can view animals through, including ones that consider their natural behavior and needs and their emotional states. While vet medicine focused on reacting to the effects of the systems animals were living in, I thought instead of drawing attention to ways of improving how they're treated in society. And at first, I focused on biological animal-based measures of animal welfare, looking at how well or not animals were faring in captive environments from zoos to farming systems, and how we might improve them. But as I've journeyed along, I see how much human perceptions and attitudes shape and perpetuate the systems that animals live within, whether those are laboratories, on farms, or our companion animals in our homes. So my attention has increasingly turned towards the human dimension of animal welfare. And I think the more we can understand people in these pictures, the more we can engage in conversations that include multiple perspectives and move our social ethic and practices forward. And that's my hope, at least.
Let's look through a brief timeline of Erin's career. Erin completed her undergraduate degree at UBC. Here, she took an Animals in Society class that shaped her opinion on the field. She then decided that she wanted to pursue it and had the opportunity to take on some science undergraduate research in the field. This then inspired her to do a PhD in applied animal biology. Now let's get back to looking into how the government regulates this animal welfare genetic modification issue. How does science inform policy?
I study how our societal decisions, including the values and attitudes we hold, affect the lives of animals through the practices that we allow. So we know that technology is a ubiquitous part of our lives, and increasingly technology is being turned to in many parts of society to solve problems and to make life more efficient and streamlined. So most recently, I've looked at how the public react to proposed applications of scientific technology, including genome editing, to address animal welfare issues for farm animals, of which 100 billion are raised every year for food. So I'm interested in engaging people from all walks of life in conversations around these issues and seeing what issues are important to them. So for example, how do people express what's important in thinking about human-animal relationships? Are animals equal to us, or are they instruments for us to use as we see fit? How do these views change by species and when other aspects of context change? Is efficiency even important to people, or do they care more about, say, potential risks? So, for example, the government or the SPCA might want to update codes of practice for the care and handling of farm animals, and work that scientists like myself do would examine how the public react to current and future practices, like removing horns without pain mitigation versus using genomic technology to create cows born without horns. That can help inform how this policy and legislation comes together by offering to the process what's most important to people when they consider specific issues.
Creating policy surrounding animal welfare is often a balancing act. On the one hand, government has to balance efficiency, and on the other hand, it has to balance societal perception. This leads us to the main question from our government section. What should the most important factors that governments consider when legislating human use of animals and animal welfare be? Now let's move on to looking at the industry. How does the industry of intensive farming work? Let's look at somewhere where the products of intensive farming might end up, the grocery store. Let's say you are given two products at a grocery store, one that doesn't have any GMOs and one that contains GMOs. Which product would you choose? As consumers, we also have a balancing act. We have to balance our perceptions of how we see GMOs versus how we value animal welfare, and sometimes these two can tip the scales. Let's ask Erin, what are some of the ethics of the industry's use of GMO animals?
Whether it's ethical or not isn't up to me to decide, but it's a question that we might pose to the public through surveys or other forms of group deliberations. And we can ask who benefits from the use of certain technologies and who does not benefit. And there are lots of ways that use of technology or the way we treat animals can be framed. And there are many ethical issues that one application of technology can bring up. And one good example is the proposition that society accept the adoption of genomic technology that would make cattle more tolerant of higher temperatures. So cows like Holsteins, which are the cows that most milk sold at supermarkets, for example, come from, they're really sensitive to heat. And all cattle could suffer more being raised in countries that are hotter, and in general, as the climate warms, these animals will increasingly feel its effects. And just to note, being too hot not only affects cow comfort, but also how much milk they produce. So on the surface, this looks like it could be a win for the animals and perhaps for producers raising these animals. But when we look closer, there are other issues to consider. And when I run a study, I look to see if the public are tuned to these issues and how they describe what's important to them. Can you think of other issues related to this example here? Like, imagine if these genetically engineered cows could withstand temperatures in the Amazon rainforest better, where it's arguably cheaper to raise animals from an industry standpoint. What happens to the forest? Does it mean more of it's cut down? What happens to the indigenous communities in and surrounding these forests? What happens to our global climate as a result? So these are conversations that are complex and hugely consequential.
This leads us to our main question from our industry section. What ethical responsibilities do companies that produce animals for human consumption have? Now let's head over to the science section, where we'll look at the science of creating GMO animals. Let's look into one of the techniques used in gene editing. This is called CRISPR. Say that we have a piece of DNA. Here I'm going to draw it lying flat. And we have a guide RNA. This RNA is something that recognizes the sequence of our DNA. What we are able to do with CRISPR is splice out a segment of DNA and insert a new gene into its place. Say you have two breeds of cows, one with horns and one without horns. There is an important stretch of DNA responsible for this difference. In the cow with horns, they have a 9 base pair deletion in a region of DNA. CRISPR allows you to introduce DNA from the hornless cow into the normally horned breed at the earliest stages of development resulting in a hornless calf. One of the risks of this method are so-called off-target effects. Bits of DNA associated with the CRISPR gene editing, such as antibiotic-resistant genes, have been found in genomes of the CRISPRed cows. Now that we've seen one example of what DNA editing can do, let's see what else DNA editing can achieve. DNA editing can help dehorn cattle, as we mentioned earlier, but it also has applications to creating more docile animals. These animals might be easier to use in intensive farming. Furthermore, DNA editing can even change how muscular an animal is. This might help with meat production. But with these technologies, we have to balance the questions: what is possible and what should we do? Let's go see what Erin thinks. What can or should we be doing with genetic modifications to animals?
Well, again, it depends on the context and what specific practices we're talking about, because what we find in our studies of public attitudes towards the use of genomic technologies is that the specifics really matter. Some applications, like genetically engineering animals to be born without horns, something I should say that's otherwise commonly dealt with by removing the horn buds without pain mitigation when calves are young, might have benefits in terms of reducing painful procedures that animals have to endure in farming environments, and they may make the working environment safer for employees. So imagine a herd of 250 or more cows indoors with big horns. Moving them around would become a different experience. But again, the need for this technology to deal with these issues also brings to light other issues of importance. One area that I'm really interested in for my doctoral work is how conversations around the use of genomic technologies bring to light issues related to commercial farming. So why are animals housed so closely together that we might have to turn to these technologies to help solve this issue of making space safer for workers?
This leads us to our main question from our science section. What criteria must be satisfied before scientists genetically modify an animal trait? Finally, let's explore the impact of genetically modifying animals on society. Earlier, we discussed the idea of purchasing power, and this is when we were choosing between purchasing a GMO or a non-GMO food. But what happens if you can't afford to purchase one product over another? Does this mean you no longer have a voice to share what you think should be done? This is not the case. You still have power to contact your local representatives and phone in your opinion, or you can vote on policies that you support. And if you can't yet vote, consider volunteering with nonprofit organizations that support ethical farming. This will still allow you to get your voice across even if you can't afford to purchase one product over another. Let's talk to Erin about this. How do consumers shape how GMO animal products are sold?
We know that people can wear two hats when it comes to addressing animal welfare issues. In some cases, they'll act as citizens who express concerns and values related to how we ought to develop our society. And they can do this through voting or when they're asked to share their social and personal values in studies. For example, in California, when voters went to pick an electoral candidate, they also saw on the ballot a proposition to ban the use of cages and increase space for farm animals like chickens and pigs and veal calves. And by the way, in 2012, the majority of voters ticked the box of Proposition 12 and made it law that by 2020, confinement for these animals is to end. But people can also act as consumers, where they use their selective hand in the market to dictate practices that they support. So as a consumer, you could purchase only free-range eggs or beef raised on pasture or organic produce if these were goods reflecting important values to you. But we know there are limits as a consumer. So maybe you can't afford these products and you're forced to buy food that doesn't resonate with what you hold important. And maybe you don't want food that's been genetically engineered, but you can't find the information that you need on the packaging to make the right decision. So work like mine and others in our program reflect what's important to people as both citizens and consumers, so that hopefully practices, including consumer practices, align with public values.
These ideas bring us to our final major question. How do your own views of GMOs change when you consider them from a consumer and citizen perspective? Now that we've discussed the impact of using GMO animals in science, government, society, and industry, what do you think? Should these practices be allowed? Thank you for watching this Gene School video. If you'd like to see more Genome BC educational content, go to genomebc.ca/education. Thanks for watching!